Good morning, everybody. If you're still standing, could you come and take a seat? And we'll get started with our program today. Who was here last night, or who was at the dinner? Wasn't that fantastic? It was a good time. Are you glad to be back today? Yes. I made sure I left nice and early to get here this morning because I thought, I don't know what traffic will be like and I might get lost, but if I'm early, I'll get a coffee. And so I left at about 6:15. I arrived early and I didn't even find a coffee shop, so how was that? Never mind. I'm from the country, from Kalgoorlie, so it's a big thing for me to come into the city here. Let's start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land we are on today. This is beautiful country, and we are so thankful that we can enjoy it. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present. We also acknowledge the work and legacy of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We commit to walk softly and gently on this land. May we continue to work diligently towards healing and restoration, which is central to our calling and Christian faith. We pray blessing on the traditional owners and on all Aboriginal peoples. May God bless this country. Let us pray. Father God, we come before you this morning. We thank you that we can meet here and learn more about you and be inspired to go out into our communities and make a difference. So we ask that you'll help us to soak in what we hear today and to apply it to our lives and strengthen us as we minister in so many different areas in this great state. So we ask for your blessing now, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Are you ready to sing? We had a little bit of a sing last night, so I thought we'd have a sing this morning as well. And I have a largely elderly congregation over in Cal, and they like to sing a hymn or two. And so we're going to start off with one of my favourite hymns. It's Great Is Thy Faithfulness. And this hymn has spoken into my life so many times throughout the years. Do you all know this one? I'm glad to hear that. I was also very blessed to attend the Frontier Services Bush Chaplain Gathering just a couple of weeks ago over in Sydney. And on one morning, the National President, Carissa, came along and shared with us. And she closed her devotion off with this beautiful hymn. We didn't have any music that morning, we just sang it a cappella, but I'll play the grand piano if that's okay. So let us stand and sing Great Is Thy Faithfulness. Let's sing. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses unite. Join with all nature in manifold wit to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, thine own dear presence to cheer and to guide, blank for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. You may be seated. I only have a 3-slide devotion this morning, so it shouldn't go any longer than about an hour. No, it's very short. Who's been to Kalgoorlie? Yes, did you drive or fly in? Drive. Train is okay. It takes the same length as driving, but you've probably seen that pipeline along the highway as you travel. And it's an amazing thing. That's how we get our water. My Bible reading for this morning is about the desert. Deuteronomy 32 verses 10 to 12, it says, "He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him and cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye." Isn't it nice to know that God keeps us as the apple of his eye? Like an eagle, it says, that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone did lead him, and there was no foreign god in him. I can testify that God alone is my strength. As I travel the thousands of kilometres that I travel, he's my mate. As I travel along in that car on my own, I often communicate with my Father in heaven. You know, Charles Y. O'Connor was a man of great vision. He was able to force water into that pipe that we've seen, restricting it and sending it way out into a riverless land. What a vision, what a difference he made. And I can go to my tap, as can anyone out there, turn it on, and there is that water. All because of one man's amazing vision. I wonder this morning, are you someone that has a vision? As you minister in the area that you're in, what is your vision? It says in Proverbs 29:18a, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." So we have to be very clear that we've got a vision. The areas we minister in could be likened to a spiritual desert, a barren wasteland where souls are struggling to survive. Our ministry and the church provide a vital lifeline, just like that pipeline going out to Kalgoorlie, bringing spiritual nourishment and refreshment to the people in our communities. And it's pretty bad out there, wouldn't you agree? I mean, we've all got it together here this morning, haven't we? But out there's broken homes. There's so much pressure and problems within people's lives, and they need us to bring that spiritual water so much. What about the waves that crash over us sometimes in our ministry? You might have faced, as you've served the Lord and the church, a wave of criticism, Have you ever done something and someone has criticized what you do? How does that make you feel? It can just about knock you out, can't it? And I've experienced that in my ministry. What about loneliness? I know I've experienced loneliness. I heard on the news just maybe last week, I think it was, that loneliness has the equivalent effect on your life as smoking 16 cigarettes every day. Isn't that astounding? So many lonely people out there. Maybe you feel a little bit alone in your ministry. Have you ever experienced disappointment? You've set something up, had what has been a great vision you thought, and it's fallen flat. And people have just left you feeling disappointed. Waves like this that rush over us can really make us feel defeated, can't they? It can even lead to bitterness. What sustains you in your ministry as you're going day after day, being a difference in this world? What sustains you? I know for me, it's my deep faith in God, my relationship with Christ. And we've got to make sure that we're grounded deep in Him and His Word, because that gives us the strength we need to carry on. It's like we've just got to walk with God day after day, talk with Him as we do our closest friends. Like the waves crashing on the shore, these waves of ministry can crash over us relentlessly, but they're not meant to defeat us. They're not meant to wipe us out. And sadly, some people do get wiped out in ministry, don't they? It becomes too much. Listen to what someone said about Charles O'Connor's vision. They said it was the height of madness to mortgage our future by imposing the debt of £2.5 million upon a small community for one particular work. Imagine if he'd given up. Well, he actually did give up just before he experienced success. Charles O'Connor gave up right before that success was achieved. What if the disciples had given up? They faced a bit of discouragement, a bit of hardship, didn't they? What if they had quit? Sometimes you've got to forge your own way. Charles went against what was accepted, what people thought was wise. And as a result, he faced huge opposition. You know, many people think that he ended his life because when they turned on the pumps, the water didn't flow. But he ended his life because he was deeply hurt by the words that people said to him. Some were saying he was dishonest and other things. And he also was overworking. He just got physically worn out. One morning, rode his horse out into the water and killed himself just before that success happened. We've got to take care of ourselves in ministry, haven't we? It's a long-term thing. And I see my calling as a bush chaplain as a long-term calling. This is my 6th year. And I still love what I do. I'm still empowered by the fact of bringing hope to young people in the goldfields, elderly folk in nursing homes, in the church out there. It still drives me on. But make sure you take care of yourself. We're not building something that will only last for a few years. We're building something that has eternity in it. Let me close with this verse from Philippians 4:11-13. It says, "For I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." Are you content in your current situation? "I know both how to be abased, I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry." It's like that in ministry sometimes, isn't it? Everything's going well, and then all of a sudden there's just not much there at all. Then it says, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." And I hope that as we leave this weekend, you go out into your communities empowered to make a real difference in people's lives. So we're going to close now by singing the song that we sang last night. Do you remember that? "Ride the Wild Water." You sang it so well that I thought it would be good if you all came out to the goldfields. Have you prayed about that? God might be calling you out there. So let's sing through this song now as we close this time of devotion. Do you want to sit down or stand? Stand. Okay. You know, in Kalgoorlie Church, we always stand for every song. but when I go to Esperance, they sit for every song. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Let's stand and sing this song together. Hear me call you to the water, feel my spirit pull your soul. Take my hand and I will lead you where the raging billows roll. Don't look down or you'll start sinking. Look ahead and you will see. There's no need to be fearful when you ride the waves with me. Ride the wild water, walk out on the sea, sail out from the harbour, come and follow after me. Ride the wild water, there's no need to fear. Though the wind and waves surround you, take my hand, I'm always here. Ride the wild sea. I can choose to just stay normal. I can choose to play it safe. I can choose to never take a chance or choose fear over faith. I can choose to sail a quiet stream or a river still and long. But it's only on the high seas that I'll grow a faith that's strong. Ride the wild water, walk out on the sea, sail out from the harbour, come and follow after me. Ride the wild water, there's no need to fear. Though the wind and waves surround you, take my hand, I'm always near. Ride the wild sea. Ride the wild water, ride the wild water, walk out on the sea, sail out from the harbour, come and follow after me. Oh, ride the wild water, there's no need to fear. Though the wind and waves surround you, take my hand, I'm always near. Ride the wild sea. Oh. You may be seated. Oh, thank you, Mari. I believe I'm passing the baton on.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to All Saints Floreat Uniting Church. Lovely to see you all here again today. It's becoming a bit of a tradition, isn't it, every February? I had to give Lindsay a clap there at the end because I think to be able to compose a song like that is fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm just here to do a couple of little housekeeping things. You'll notice that there are exits at that corner and exits at this corner, and the assembly point, if you have to run out in a hurry, is over on the park. Sorry? Oh, no, possibly not. The toilets are out through the hall or out through the back page room, and morning tea and lunch will be served in the hall. And you can take your morning tea or your lunch and go outside or sit inside or take it wherever you like. So the children will be going out to their activities with Julie this morning. She's waving at the back. Can you see her? And they'll be in with us this afternoon. So please enjoy your day, and I would like to hand over to Andy.
Good morning. I'd just like to very quickly add to Mari's welcome, a big welcome to the people that are joining us via live stream. I think if I wave there, they'll see me. Great to have you with us, and really glad you've made the effort to be a part of today. It's my great privilege now to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning, who is, of course, Mike Frost. I first came across Mike about 25 years ago when I saw this book on my father-in-law's shelf by Mike. It's called Jesus the Fool. And it kind of really caught my attention. It sort of blew my tiny mind a bit. I thought, can you say that? Jesus the Fool. And so I thought, I have to read this. What's he talking about? It's a fantastic read. It was quite formative for me. One of the things that Mike says in that book is that when it comes to the world's kind of standards as to what life is all about and what's important and what our values and attitudes should be, Jesus was a fool. He advocated for the upside down kingdom, and he calls people to be a part of making that kingdom a reality. And so Mike has been championing that call for many years. Through speaking, he speaks actually all over the world. Through his lecturing, he lectures in different places, but he has a permanent job at Morling Theological College in Sydney. He's been a lecturer there for a long time, and also through the authoring of books. I think it's 12 books. Is that correct, Mike? That's what I counted. Who could say? So 12 books. And Mike's latest book, Mission is the Shape of Water, I know many of the people here have been reading that in preparation for today. It's an excellent read. I've read it, except for the last chapter, because my daughter accidentally trod on and broke my Kindle. So I'm hoping for a bit of closure. I'm hoping for a bit of closure today, Mike. So it's fantastic to have you here with us. We're so grateful that you've come. And Mike's going to help us unpack what it means to engage with what God is doing in the world. So can you join me in welcoming Mike to the stage?
Thanks, Andy. Hey, everyone. I do have to apologise for my voice. I actually normally do have a gravelly kind of voice, but I've got a bit of a cough. I haven't been... Actually, I felt fine, but I don't sound so good. And then after that flight last night, I sound even more kind of gummed up. So will my apologies right up front. Maybe if I said nothing, you wouldn't have even noticed. So first up, sorry about that, but it is great to be in Western Australia and on a beautiful day. It's not hot, it's cool and sunny and fantastic. Good to be here. My only recollections of being in the West are when it's stinking hot, so I've landed on a good day. And so thanks to Andy and the team for their invitation for me to speak with you. I'm on a bit of a Uniting Church Presbytery tour at the moment. This is my third one so far, so I might be in the process of converting or something. I don't know what happens, how that works, what you have to do to me, but I've been hanging out with Uniting Church people a fair bit lately, and recognising your great diversity and your great heritage and history, both through kind of the Methodist and Wesleyan traditions and Presbyterian traditions and Congregationalists, and through the Uniting Church and all that you have been and are doing in this country. So I appreciate, usually, when I come to these meetings, Uniting Church people are all like, we're struggling, we're not doing great. But hey, God is at work. His kingdom is unfurling inexorably through us, through our churches, and throughout history. And so be encouraged. I think the Lord is doing great and interesting things, maybe not the old things, but interesting and new things in and through his people. So let me start by telling you about a trip I took recently, a few years ago now actually, to Europe with a group of my students. I took them on a field trip to explore postmodern, we were calling it in those days, postmodern expressions of church in post-Christendom in Europe. And if you don't know what any of that means, doesn't matter. It was a junket. We went to Europe and went to lots of really kind of lovely cities. No, we did actually some really good and interesting work and encountered a whole lot of church planters and pastors and missionaries doing really interesting grassroots things. But the first stop on our trip was, we flew into Rome, but our first visit really was to Pompeii. I really wanted my students to catch a feel for what pre-Christian Europe might have been like. We're about to look at what post-Christian Europe looked like. But I really wanted them to kind of capture the sense of the very early church. Maybe some of you have been to Pompeii. I'm sure you've all heard about Pompeii, that it is an ancient city that was just kind of frozen in time, as it were, because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And it's been excavated now. I mean, you can go to lots of cities where you walk through ruins, but when you walk through Pompeii, you can really feel what an ancient Roman city would have been like. You're walking down cobblestone streets, you can walk into people's houses, you can walk to the marketplace and the forum, you can kind of really feel and imagine what it would have been like. And I invited a scholar from London to join us. He's an expert in this particular field, and he led a walking tour through the city. And one of his primary things was to say, not just to point out, here's this and here's that, but it was also to say, imagine if this were typical of a Roman city. Imagine what it would be like if a church met, if Christians, a Christian community, was thriving in this particular city. As it were, not just to question whether there were Christians in Pompeii, but to use it as a case study of all Roman communities. You with me so far? And so one of the really interesting things he did was he took us into what we today might consider to be a housing project or a block of flats. Not a block of flats going up, but a community where a series of dwellings were built in a kind of square formation around a central courtyard. You walk into it off the street into a kind of, I guess you would say, an indoor courtyard, a kind of an atrium, and then from there out into a courtyard which was gardened, and then had a walkway all the way around with all these doors which were different apartments where people lived. And he said, just try to imagine that one of the families that lived in one of those homes was a Christian community. It would not have been uncommon for that particular Christian to say to the church community of which he or she was part, hey, why don't you use my courtyard for our gatherings? And maybe it would rotate around different places, but it would be very common in the first few centuries for Christians to meet in a courtyard like that. Or if the weather was wet, in the atrium as you first arrive. And you would pull out long tables and you would seat it around the table. You would bring food to the meal, food to the banquet. He even took us to what looked like a takeaway food restaurant. It was like an L-shaped bar that had big holes in the top, underneath which were fires had been lit, and there'd be big pots sitting in these holes, and you'd take your earthenware pot and order a scoop of this or a bunch of that, and then you would take it off to your Christian gathering. It's just like an ancient Christian potluck supper, right? You would place your bit of food on the table, and then you would join with everyone sitting together in this kind of semi-private, semi-public kind of gathering. He said they often happened in courtyards like this or in atriums. They may even happen in back alleys. He took us down some really narrow back alleys. He said some of these which would not have been used for a lot of traffic, they would even put tables in these kinds of places. Maybe in a marketplace, but probably not as public as that. But they were open to the eyes of everyone. Everyone who lived in that particular housing block would arrive home that night and would see, oh, there's a table set up and there's a meal is going to happen. And one of the things he explained to us is that wouldn't have been perceived as being weird or unusual or different, because there were lots of groups that did exactly that. Often guild meetings would meet around a big long table and share food and enter into a kind of a conversation around the table. Now, a guild was a business, specifically a businessman's gathering. It was a gathering for men who worked in the same field. So all the silversmiths would have their guild. All the merchants of such and such a product would have their guilds. All the tradespeople who built certain things, stonemasons or carpenters, would have their own guilds. And a guild meeting was kind of like this. All the men in that particular profession would gather. They would share food together. They would often slaughter a small animal or a bird. They would send a burnt offering. They would burn an animal, and the smoke and the prayers would go up to the heavens. And they would pray to the patron god of silversmiths or carpentry or whatever the case may be, that this year might be another good year in business. And then they would eat and drink and they'd talk business. It was like a kind of a religious Lions Club or Rotary Club meeting, right? Those things happened in the ancient world all the time. And it was very common for them to happen in courtyards just like the one that I just described, or in back alleys, or in marketplaces. So it would be nothing for you to be arriving home in your particular apartment in this housing complex. That night from work, you turn back home from work, you're tired, you're worn out. As you get there, you walk into the atrium, you arrive at the courtyard, and then there's a big long table. There are people gathering, and you're like, oh, that's right, it's a guild meeting tonight. Well, you had nothing to do with this guild meeting. You weren't in that profession. You might not even be a man. You might not be a free man. You might be a foreigner. Like, if you were not a man in that profession and a member of that guild, you were invisible to them. And so you would just walk down the covered walkway into your home and you prepare your own meal. They would pay you no mind and you would pay them no mind. These guild meetings were entirely always for men, for free men of a particular business or profession, and obviously, given they were in the same profession, of the same socio-economic grouping. If you're a woman, a slave, if you were poor, if you were a foreigner, you were invisible to them. You all with me? But he said when the Christians started gathering, it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. You would turn up into your housing complex, walk through the atrium, there's a table, oh, right, it's a guild meeting. But you look twice and you would think, it's not like any guild meeting I've ever seen before. Because it was not just for men. There were men and women gathered together around this table. Not women serving men, not women preparing food and bringing the food, men and women sitting side by side around the table. Like what? Not only that, if you looked a little bit more carefully, you would see that there were enslaved people and free people, rich people. There were Jews, Gentiles, immigrants, citizens. It was unlike anything you had ever seen. For us today, it's very common to see a mixed audience like that. But when you walked into that courtyard or down that back alley or into that marketplace and you saw that table and you saw that gathering of people, you were literally, what? It was unheard of. It was kind of visceral in its impact. And here's the other interesting thing. As you just tried to walk around them and go to your home and pay them no mind because you're not part of this particular community, whatever it might be, rather than ignoring you the way guilds would do, rather than you just looking in another direction as you would normally do, they would call out to you and they would say, friend, have you eaten tonight? Have you prepared your meal? Like, no, don't go and prepare something now. It's late. Come, eat our meat. Drink our wine. Join us at this table. And they also had some kind of ritual, not with burnt offerings, not with prayers going up to the skies, not with animals or anything, but they used bread and wine and they said a certain kind of form of words together. And then remarkably, it's unheard of. I've never seen anything like it before. That woman would stand up and prophesy. And that young child would speak in tongues. And someone would interpret it. And then someone would bring a song. And then someone would add something else. And someone would share a testimony. And this whole orchestrated mess would kind of coalesce together into this great testimony of the power Christ had made in their lives. And when you would say to them, like, which God are you praying to? And why don't you send smoke up to the gods? And who is in charge here? They would say, oh, friend, don't you realize our God is not up there. Our God promised us that where 2 or 3 would gather, he's at this table. Stanley Hauer said this. He said the early church did not conquer the Roman Empire with swords or with spears, but with tables. tables of fellowship unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The invitation for people to join, to eat, to be blessed, to be prayed for, to enter fully into a community which was so oriented around such a peculiar set of values. It was a group of people unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Now, my friends, I'm not proposing that the answer for us is to start having church around tables out on the park across the road. Although, why not? I'm not proposing that we do these sort of semi-public, private kind of gatherings as were possible in the Mediterranean area of the Roman Empire. But I am suggesting to you what we need to recover is our inherent calling as God's people to be a peculiar kind of people, the likes of which others have never encountered before, a new kind of human working collectively as well as individually on seeking to become more and more aligned to the values of the reign of God as revealed to us by Christ, and letting people see what that looks like in whatever ways or means we could possibly find. Do you follow? See, most of what we do as Christians these days is in private places where no one ever sees us. Most of what we do doesn't invite us to workshop on being this new kind of person, or to allow the unbeliever or the inquirer or the outsider or the fringe dweller to participate fully in the discovery of this kind of magnificent vision of being human that Christ has taught us. Most of what we do is private. No one knows what goes on. I could guarantee you, I could go and interview all the neighbours around here and ask, do you know what goes on in that place? And they wouldn't have a clue. No disrespect to this congregation whatsoever. We once took over an old Baptist church in Sydney. It had died, the congregation had closed. It was a magnificent old building. We were renovating and turning it into a performance space, an art gallery, counselling centre, coffee shop, all that kind of stuff. Neighbours were coming from across the road, and they were saying, what's happening here? Oh, I said, we're renovating it. I was telling them what we were doing, and they would say, could we have a look inside? Yeah, sure. I said, come on in. I mean, it's a lovely building. It's got the slate roof and the stained glass windows and all that kind of jazz. And do you know how people who don't go to church often come into church like with their head bowed, like something is going to happen to them? And I would say to them, they were like, this is beautiful. I had no idea. Like, in my own street, this building is here. And I would say, oh, are you new to the neighbourhood? And what do you think they would say? No, I've lived here for 15 years. I lived here for 20 years. I raised my kids here. Like, it's just a big brick building. Whatever goes on within it is an absolute mystery to us. And that's the way it is with most of your churches, if you don't mind me saying so. I was once in London and I had to speak at a meeting at a particular church. I couldn't find it. They'd drawn a map for me. This is, I think, before GPS and stuff like that. They'd drawn a mud map for me, go left here, right there. I did everything that was said. I'm looking around. I can't find a church anywhere. I went into a medical centre. And I said to the woman behind the counter, I'm looking for this church, and it said, see this map, it should be here. And she's looking at it, like, oh no, you are right here. But no, we're a medical centre, not a church. I was like, what's with that? And I walked outside, walked next door, and just happened to look up, and there was the sign to the church. You had to go down a side alley to get to it. The people next door didn't even know it was there. Like, they're doctors, they're health professionals, no clue. Like, for the most part, I guess if you don't have an animal or a pet, you could drive past a vet every day of your life and not even know it was there. And yet what we discovered when we were in Pompeii that day was that the early church actually lived their life outwards, outdoors, out under the noses of those who'd not yet been set free. I think the mission of the church is to alert everyone, everywhere, to the universal reign of God through Christ. Do you think that's a pretty good definition? If I do say so myself, what do you reckon? That's pretty good? Let me say it again. The mission of God's people is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God through Christ. I think it's so good, I stole it from somebody else. David Bosch said that in 1989. The mission of God's people is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God through Christ. The early church did that around tables. They demonstrated what it was like to be a new kind of society, brought together in the love of Christ. Slave and free, rich and poor, male or female, to have been made one in this new kind of society. They demonstrated what it was like not to pray to a God who is far away, who we hope to goodness will hear our prayers, but to say that very presence of God is with us as we gather. These were people who were committed to the values of the kingdom, like justice and peacemaking and healing and joy. That there was a whole new way of organising society bursting forth in these little microcosms around tables. And my friends, the same task is the one that we're called to fulfill to this day. To be a different kind of society, a new kind of human. A human of peace and justice and joy and healing, who experience the very presence of God and who are committed to developing a new kind of society in a world which is so fractured and torn apart, and to alert people to that vision. So people who believe in the mission of God's people and who agree that it is to alert everyone to the universal reign of God through Christ spend a lot of time examining what the reign of God through Christ looked like, because that's our task, is it not? Like, people should look at your church, look at your life, hear you, encounter you, understand something of who you are, and they ought to be getting clues for what the reign of God through Christ looks like. It's a terrifying kind of thought, isn't it? Like, what do you think your neighbours know about the reign of God through Christ from their observance of you and your congregation? What do they see? Oh, I don't have an answer for this, but this is the central question, is it not? If our mission is to alert people to the reign of God, then we ought to be really good at talking about and demonstrating what the reign of God looks like. Now, I've actually tested this out. I've been to congregations. I do it with classes every year. When a new group of students comes into my class, I say, take out a sheet of paper and write down the answer to this question. What is the universal reign of God through Christ? And it takes ages for people to kind of think, what does that mean? What do you think that is? Put down a few thoughts. It doesn't flow, folks. It doesn't emerge naturally or obviously. And yet, and maybe these are the circles I operate in, but if I was to say to somebody, write down the gospel. What is the gospel? People are usually really quick to be able to do that one. Usually it's like God loves you, Jesus died for you, you get to go to heaven when you die, you accept Jesus as your saviour, something along those lines. Lots of us had drummed into us, we had to learn to preach this thing called the gospel. And the gospel was always just reduced down to this idea of a theory of atonement. But actually that's not what we're called to do. We're called to alert people to the reign of God. We want people to observe our life and to hear our words and to know something more of what the universal reign of God through Christ looks like. And this isn't just a Christian task. This has always been the task facing the people of God. This has been the task of people in the Old Covenant, was to alert people to the universal reign of God through Christ. 3 times in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah refers to something similar to this, where he says, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who evangelize, to put it into a Greek term. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. And then he tells you what the good news is. Who declare our God reigns. To alert people to the reign of God is an old covenant task as much as it is a new covenant in Christ. Do you follow? When you think about it, where was Isaiah's audience when he wrote that? When he told them how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who declare our God reigns. What situation were God's people in at that time? They were in exile, in captivity. They were in Babylon. So what he's saying is, how beautiful on the mountains in Babylon are the feet of those who declare our God reigns. And then when you think about the mountains in Babylon, what happens in the high places in pagan empires like Babylon? The high places are reserved for what? For pagan worship and fertility rites, right? Repulsive places to the Jews. So what Isaiah is kind of saying is, how beautiful are the feet of those who are foolhardy enough here in the darkest place, in the darkest empire in the world, to dare to speak into a tsunami of evil and say, our God reigns. Friends, that was the task of God's people always. Even if all the evidence appears to be to the contrary, we will still, as loyal followers of Christ, declare our God reigns. Even if there are less Christians in Perth this year than there were last year, our God reigns. Even if it's more difficult to be openly Christian in our society today than it was 10 years ago, our God reigns. Our God reigns. Even if there is, as Lindsay was saying, more loneliness, more brokenness, more polarization in our society, our God reigns. We declare it not based on the evidence, but on faith. So our task, my friends, whether we do it around tables or whether we do it embedded in our neighbourhoods, our task is to let people see what it looks like for God to reign in our lives and for that to actually find form and language in our society. To be people who walk closely with God, who are fashioning a new kind of society, who are committed to joy and peace and healing and justice. This is the kind of person God has called us to, and we need to let people see what it looks like when that starts to take root in a person's heart and the heart of a community of faith. Now, I mentioned that David Bosch's definition went, the mission of God's people is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God through Christ. And I've talked about the need for us to know what the reign of God through Christ looks like in order that we're able to alert people to it. But he chooses that very interesting English word to describe our task. He says we are to alert people to the reign of God. It's interesting that he doesn't say we are to tell people about the reign of God. And he doesn't simply say we are to show people the reign of God. He uses a really kind of loose kind of term, alert. There are multiple ways that you can alert somebody to something, aren't there? Like my daughter is pregnant, she's going to have a baby in July. When the baby's born, she will alert everyone to the fact the baby has been born. What do you think might be the first way that she does that? Okay, if I find out about my grandchild being born on Facebook, I'm going to be a very unhappy grandfather. I think there's a step a little bit before that. I think that there's usually a group of people who get the text message, right? An SMS comes out, he's arrived, he's healthy, he's happy. The inner circle gets words and words alone. But are words enough? No, of course not. I've been alerted to this, that's cool, but what do I want now? Photos, exactly. That's where Instagram and Facebook or whatever comes in. Photos arrive. We get to see all these photos, and you get to kind of explain how dilated you were when you went to the hospital, and all sorts of information that I don't really need to know. Like, you put all that out there. So it's like words go out first, and then photos go out next. But again, if you're particularly close to my daughter, as I am, that's not good enough either, is it? Unless I live in some foreign country, which I don't. I'm right here, she's in Sydney. What do I want? To be fully alerted to the birth of this grandchild is I want you to put him in my arms, right? I want to smell the top of his head. I want to hold him. Like, there are multiple ways that you alert people to something. Sometimes it's just words. Sometimes it's pictures. Sometimes hold this, feel this, touch this. And David Bosch uses that word very carefully, I think. Your task is to alert everyone in your neighbourhood to the reign of God. Do you believe that God reigns? Do you believe his reign is utter and total and complete? Do you think he reigns as one of many gods? Or he's maybe the most reigning God? Or do you think he reigns utterly, totally, and completely and is unchallenged by any other gods? If you believe that, your task is to alert people to that and to alert people to what world God wants us to create in and through his Holy Spirit. And the way you do that is by alerting people through a variety of means. Sometimes you will just talk. Sometimes it will just be words. Sometimes an opportunity happens, you sit on a plane, someone asked, it wasn't a plane for me yesterday, it was my Uber to the airport. A German woman is driving to the airport. What are you going to Perth for on the weekend? I'm speaking at a conference. What are you speaking about? Boom, we just start talking about Jesus and the church, and she's Lutheran and blah, blah. Words, I don't get to demonstrate anything. I don't get to do any act of kindness. I don't get to serve her. I just speak words about what the reign of God looks like. You ever had that opportunity? Take them. But there are other times where you just get to perform acts of kindness as an expression of the reign of God, right? I saw a woman the other day, an elderly woman, pushing a trolley to her car, trying to get all groceries down 3 stairs it was, and out to her car. So I said, can I help you? I take her trolley, take it over to her car. I even take the bags out and put them in the boot of her car. I didn't at the end of that say, excuse me, before you go, that act of kindness was brought to you by the reign of God. It's just an act of kindness. No words. Sometimes it's just words. Sometimes there's no words. Both are legitimate ways to alert people to the reign. But there are lots of opportunities in between where it's both words and deeds. In fact, I would suggest to you, if you're only doing deeds, if you're only showing people through your actions what the reign of God looks like, but you never get to decipher that for them, how could they be any the wiser that your act of kindness is an expression of the Holy Spirit's work in your life to alert people to the reign of God? Do you follow? Words must be included at some point, even though I realise not at every single point. By the same token, if it's only words, if all you're ever doing is just evangelising, just talking non-stop all the time about Jesus, there's something kind of relationally abusive about that, isn't it? That it's just words and no actions. Neither end of the spectrum is the ideal, although, as I've said, at times the end of the spectrum will be all you can do under the circumstances. But my view would be that as you live and work in a particular neighbourhood, and as you remain rooted and connected to those people, over a period of time, they should have had some conversations with you. They should have seen some expressions of the values of the kingdom. They should have seen what it looks like for that to have been explained to them. Not all at once, not with one program, not just because you ran Alpha 6 months ago, not just because you've got this feeding program in your church, but over an extended period of time, they would have heard words, they would have seen deeds, they would have had things explained to them, and they start to get a perception of the new kind of human that you and your church are committed to being in the name of Jesus. Do you follow? There are times when we just speak, there are other times when we just act, but under all circumstances, we want people to understand what the reign of God looks like. So your task, should you choose to accept it, as leaders in your congregations, is to equip your congregation to be great at being able to speak and describe and explain what the reign of God is like. To say, friend, come, eat our meat, drink our wine, listen to our prayers, see our healings, experience our joy. To invite people into this magnificent new kind of community that we are committed to fulfilling. And so shame on us, those of us that have come from churches that are full of judgmental, distant, frightened, fearful people. Shame on us that we've let our congregations become people where people don't feel included or welcomed or loved, where they don't see a different kind of society. They don't see freedom and joy and peace and happiness. Shame on us to the degree to which we have dropped the ball on that. You can actually conquer the whole empire with a table, friends. find ways to be that table in your neighbourhood so that they see the quality of your relationships and they're inspired by the calling that Christ has placed upon our lives. Some years ago I was in Cambodia speaking to a group of Khmer pastors. I should tell you that Khmer pastors nearly all look like accountants. They have white business shirts buttoned up at the wrist. They have their hair parted on one side. They have like very respectable glasses. And as I'm speaking to them, they nod and write down things that I say through an interpreter. I often don't feel like I really fit in, but they asked me to go there and speak to them about the mission of God's people. They're usually all men and older men at that. On this one occasion I want to tell you about, I was speaking to this group of Khmer pastors, speaking to them about the mission of God, and in the back row, against the wall, there's this young guy sitting there wearing a black leather jacket and reflective wraparound sunglasses. He does not look like a Khmer pastor. So I was pretty sure he was not a pastor. Maybe he was just some guy who wanted to practice listening to English or something, because he would sit there with his arms folded and he would nod every so often at stuff I said. So I thought, maybe he understands. I don't know who he is. Now, we were at a kind of meeting room above a French bakery. Has anyone here been to Cambodia? Like, it's very hot, right? So can you imagine what it would be like in a room above a French bakery in Cambodia? Like, I am dripping with perspiration. The cat at the back of the room is in a black leather jacket. Super impressed by this. But I keep thinking, if I go outside onto the veranda out here, which overlooks the Tonle Sap River, there'd be a lovely cool breeze wafting off the river. So I might go out there during the coffee break. Now, when the Lord invented the world, He created all these immutable laws within the cosmos, aerodynamics, gravity, stuff like that. One of those laws was that there would never be a cool breeze in Cambodia, ever. So when we break for coffee and freshly baked French pastries, the last thing I felt like under those circumstances, I make a beeline for the veranda. Stand on the edge looking out over the river. It's no cooler, it's still stinking hot. But while I'm standing out there, the cat with the leather jacket comes and stands next to me. He introduces himself. He said, "Hi, I'm Abraham Hang." Abraham, I said. Abraham is a Bible name. Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, a Khmer person would only have a name like Abraham if they were like a Christian. Yeah, that's right. Well, I said, but this is a gathering for pastors. That's right. Well, he said, what do you think I'm doing here? I said, you're a pastor. And he said, why does everyone ask me that in that tone of voice? I said, I can tell you why, because you look like a cat, not like a pastor, that's for sure. I said, what's your story? He said, it's not that interesting, really. And then he tells me this story, and folks, it's really interesting. Abraham Hang was a small-time crook. He used to smuggle stuff across the Khmer-Thai border, sell it at a premium in the markets. He had a little gang of kind of thieves that were kind of supplying him with materials. He was a bad kid, actually. One day, the cops find out about him and they come after him, and so he takes it on the lam. He kind of gets out of town, goes and hides out in a small little rural village in the middle of nowhere until the heat dies down. And while he's in this small little village, he starts, for whatever reason, going to a local church, which is led by a pastor with a white business shirt buttoned at the wrists, with his hair parted on one side and conservative glasses. And this guy shares what the reign of God is like with Abraham, and he becomes totally and radically converted. He started going to the church. I used to go to the Wat to do business. I'd go to the Wat, and while the ceremony's going on, I'd be smoking. You want to buy TV? You want to buy a camera? Like, I'm doing deals. So I come to the church. I didn't know you had to be quiet in church. I didn't know you couldn't ask questions. So I'm in church, I'm smoking, and I'm like, what's that song mean? Why are we singing this? What's this thing about Kalgoorlie and the water? Why are you doing that? What's happening here? Why is it? It'd be like a million questions. And in the end, the pastor says to him, Abraham, you've got so many questions. We can't answer them all. He said, maybe you should consider going to Bible college. I thought, that's interesting. An adult convert that the local church can't cope with, so they send him to theological college. That happens in my country too. So he goes to Phnom Penh Bible School. He does a diploma in ministry. He doesn't feel called into the ministry. He's just trying to get backfill on all the stuff he now believes as a follower of Jesus. He meets another student. They fall in love. They get married. She becomes pregnant. They graduate. He says, I then went to every denomination, every church, every NGO, every Christian organisation, every single one of them. I turned up for an interview. I turned up wearing a black leather jacket, jeans, wraparound reflective sunglasses, with my diploma ministry in hand, saying, would you like me to be a pastor in one of your churches? And one by one they all said, no thanks, no thanks, no thanks, because he doesn't look like a pastor. Did you get the message? And so he said, I was standing, and we're on this veranda looking out over the Tinsley River. He said, I was standing by the river right there, and I cried out to God. I said, God, what are you doing? What do you want from me? Like, I only know how to do two things in this world. I can be a pastor or I can be a criminal. And I said, you could have moved to the US. I mean, there's always combine those things. No, I said, no, forget I said that. He said, I was stuck. I couldn't go back to my way. I had no way forward. And I cried out in anguish, what do you want from me? And he said, at that point, God answered that prayer in the most terrible way. He said, on the other side of the river, there used to be a squatter village. You've been to Southeast Asia with the big high banks on rivers, that the flood in the wet season and they're really low in the dry season. And there's all these corrugated iron boxes, sheds on big bamboo poles perched on the edge of these really steep banks. They're all throughout Southeast Asia. He said on the riverbank there was a squatter village up and down the river as far as you could see. He said, I just cried out to God, what do you want from me? And a convoy of military lorries pulls up on the other side of the river. And with a loud hailer, the military commanders are telling people that bulldozers are coming, all of these houses are going to be levelled, grab your things, get into the back of these trucks, we're repatriating you to another part of the city. So people were screaming for their children, grabbing their belongings, packing what little they had, getting their pots and pans and chickens and children, not in that order, children first, and climbing into the backs of these trucks. He said, Mike, it was like something from Stalin's Russia. He said, I'm just standing there with my mouth hanging open while all this chaos is occurring. They are loading hundreds and hundreds of families into these trucks. And then the first truck takes off and this convoy pulls out throughout the streets of Phnom Penh. And I had just cried out, God, what do you want from me? And he said, I swear it was an audible voice, Mike. I heard this voice say to me, there is your church. Whoa, I said, Abraham, what did you do? He said, I got on my moto and I followed the convoy. It wound throughout the streets of Phnom Penh, out onto the road to the airport, out past the airport, out into rice paddies. It took a right-hand turn along a muddy road, out like literally into swamp. And there it disgorged hundreds of families into the swamp. And they threw corrugated iron and bamboo and tools and they said, here, you can live here. He said, now that I knew where they were, I turned my bike around. I went home. My wife had been praying all day for me to get a job. I burst in the door. I said, honey, I've got a church. I know we can laugh about this, but Abraham was 26 years old when he moved his pregnant wife into what is now called Andong Resettlement Village. He got corrugated iron and bamboo and he built a hut and he moved in to one of the poorest slums in one of the poorest countries in the world. I said, Abraham, how do you start? What do you do? He said, well, I just started asking myself, what does the reign of God look like here? I read David Bosch and some of that kind of stuff, so I was like, what does the reign of God look like in this place? And he said, I thought to myself, well, you know, we live up to our ankles in mud in the dry season, up to our knees in the wet season. And I thought, living in mud is not what the reign of God would be like. Don't you believe, Mike, that in the reign of God we would walk on dry land? Now, to my shame, my friends, I'd never even thought to ask what kind of land we would walk on in the reign of God, but now that you mention it, yeah, I guess it would be dry. Right, he said, so I called on my friends from Bible College. They're all now pastors of churches all over Phnom Penh. They all descended on Andong. All the men came from these different churches. They bought tools together with the men in Andong. We dug these huge channels all the way through the swamp. Now, when it rains, the water runs off and away, and we live on a little dry oasis in the middle of swamp, because dry land is an expression of the reign of God. And then he said, I saw all these kids, their teeth were falling out, they had terrible dental hygiene, sicknesses would sweep through the slum. And I thought to myself, no, in the reign of God there's no sickness and no disease. And I thought, I have thought about that one before, so yes, that's true. No sickness or disease, right. He said, so right. So he said, I just called every single Christian doctor and dentist, Khmer and expatriate. I called every single doctor and dentist. I made an appointment. I waited in the waiting room. They called me in for a consult. I'd go in and I'd say, look, I feel fine, my teeth are fine. I need to let you know. He said, I'd pull out my diploma in ministry and I say, this diploma qualifies me to tell you what I'm about to say. There is a verse somewhere in the Bible that says there's a special place in hell reserved for any doctor or dentist that does not come to Andong Resettlement Village. And he said they would all do what you just did. They would all laugh and he'd say, yeah, no, but seriously, like what about the third Thursday of the month? And in the end, he sets up a mobile dental and medical clinic. There's now a permanent clinic in Andong. And then he realises that they're all living under corrugated iron, which is a little bit like living in a microwave oven. So he meets a woman who's a missionary from a mega church in Seattle. He said, Mike, I didn't even know what a mega church was, but it sounded good to me because I thought mega church could mean mega money. And I was like, you got it. And he said, so I said to her, do you reckon your church could help fund the building of thatch roof housing? This one church has paid, I don't know how many thousands of dollars to provide the materials for them to get out from under corrugated iron into thatch roof housing. You don't want to live in a thatch roof house in a slum in Cambodia, but for them it's luxury. And then he started a church, and then a preschool, and then a school, and then he said to me, I could talk about it all day. He said, would you like to see it? I said, Abraham, I've been to lots of slums in Southeast Asia, but I would love nothing more than to see this. So after I'd finished teaching those pastors, he put me on the back of his moto. We drove out through the teeming streets of Phnom Penh, out past the airport, out through the rice paddies, out to the swampland, and there is Andong, on an island surrounded by swamp. We walked through the streets of Andong and I could hear kids playing in the playground of the school. I saw the clinic. I saw all the houses. People would come out of their homes as they saw me, clearly a foreigner, in town, and they would greet me as the Khmer do, and then they'd start speaking to me. I'd say, Abraham, what is this man telling me? Oh, stop bothering Mike. He's just telling you how he used to gamble all the family's money away, but Jesus come into his life and set him free and healed him from that, and now he doesn't do that anymore. Well, I said, well, that's a pretty good story. Then a woman would go, she used to drink all the family money away, but the Lord has helped free her from her addiction. I mean, people are coming out of their homes to testify to me about the power of the reign of God unfurling in their lives. And then we went to a coffee shop. It was still corrugated iron, and we were on bamboo platform, and the coffee was probably the worst coffee I've ever had in my whole life. So I said, well, there is still a lot of kingdom work to be done here, Abraham. And I said, Abraham, this is just one of the most beautiful missional projects I've ever seen. It's just like what I described in Pompeii. It's out in the middle of the community. It's bringing healing and hope and repair and justice and mercy and kindness and beauty and faith in the midst of the poisoned soil of Cambodia. I said, who shaped your thinking? Like you mentioned David Bosch before, but what books have you read? Like who gave you the ideas to do this? And he's like, so who? David Bosch, what? No, I said, well, who did you read? His English is pretty good and my Khmer is zero. So I tried to more simply ask, who inspired you to do what you're doing? What did I think I was asking? Do you know all those Christian books you read, from all these experts around the world? None of them get translated into Khmer. No publisher sees any value in it. He said, I got what you mean. Yeah, no, okay, well, I read Luke and Acts. So that was super helpful. And Isaiah, I couldn't have done it without that. I was thinking, this 26-year-old kid moved into Andong, read Isaiah and Luke and Acts, and just did it. Doesn't it make you want to ask yourself, what are you doing? With all the freedom and autonomy and opportunity and education and resourcing you have, what are you doing? What does it look like for you? Not just you individually, but you as a community, to fashion islands of hope, expressions of the reign of God, alerting people to a new way, a different way, a better way to be human. Do you follow? Your mission, should you choose to accept it, or whether you like it or not, is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God through Christ. So I've got two questions for you before I take a break. To whom have you been sent? Can you name them? What's your parish? What's your people group? What's your neighbourhood? Where do they live? What pathway of life are they on? What are their hopes or fears? To whom have you been sent? Because unless you can answer that, you don't even throw a six or get started in the game. And you can't answer that by saying you're sent to such and such a uniting church. I'm asking, to whom beyond the church have you been sent? I know lots of clergy feel they got sent to this church or that church, but I want you to think about sentness as being a thing that we as Christians experience beyond the faith community. To which set of neighbours or people group or parish have you been sent? What are their names? What are they like? How are you fostering relationship with them? How are you walking alongside them in life? And then the second question would be, what would they be able to tell you about the universal reign of God through Christ from observing your life or your community's life? I put this to one of my classes once, and a student came back to me and she said, I live in a cul-de-sac. She was a woman in her 50s at that point. I live in a cul-de-sac. I lived there. It was our first home we ever bought. Everyone who lives there has lived there for a really long time. We all raised our kids in that cul-de-sac. All of our kids have moved on, left home. We know each other really, really well. We're a really tight community. We have Christmas street parties and all that kind of jazz. So she said, when you ask that question, what would they be able to tell you about the reign of God through Christ from observing your life? I thought, I know my neighbours really well, and I think they really like me. So I conducted a survey. I asked everyone in the cul-de-sac. She didn't mention the universal reign of God through Christ because they may not know what the heck that means. But what did you glean about being a Christian from observing me and my husband? Can you guess what the number one answer was? Well, so I think someone said, you go to church. Close. You're super busy with your religion. You're always driving in and out and going off to things, including church. Now, I mentioned to you before some of the values of the reign of God. the presence of God, a new kind of society, justice, peacemaking, healing, hope, joy. Did I mention busyness in there as one of the values of the kingdom? Is that what people would glean from your life? You're always rushing off to church or church meetings of some kind or another. There's nothing wrong with doing lots of things which are good. But unless people can actually see, you spend your money differently to the way they do. You invest your time differently to the way they do. You love, you serve, you heal. Unless people can see this, what would they be learning? In what way are you alerting people to the reign of God, both through your actions as well as through your words? You with me? Sometimes after you've done that a lot, after people have observed you as being a different kind of person and knowing your partnership and your loyalty to them, they ask you, what is it about this and why do you live this way? And that's the opportunity you get to decipher all the stuff that's been happening and help it to make sense for them. Do you all know who Patrick White is, the great Australian novelist? Yeah, it's an older audience, so I figured. I can tell you now, none of my students have ever heard of him. He's the only Australian to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? He's a legend. He was particularly popular, I guess, in the post-war period. He got the Nobel Prize in the 1970s. By the time he got to the 1970s, after he'd won the Nobel Prize, he was a big, gregarious, loud, confident man. You might say somewhat full of himself, actually. He was living with his partner Manly on a little hobby farm in Castle Hill on the west of Sydney. It's now just suburbia. He was openly gay. He was an open critic of the church. He was a confident man, the master of his own world. If you've ever read his autobiography, Flaws in the Glass, he tells this one little story in the middle of it, which is really intriguing. He says one day he and Manly were at the farm. It had been pouring with rain. It had been raining cats and dogs for days, it seemed like. He said he needed to feed the dogs that lived in the shed down at the bottom of the property. So he loaded up all these trays, all these bowls on a tray, filled them with wet dog food, put on his raincoat and his hat, pulled on his galoshes, picked up his tray, backed his way out the screen door and started to walk down the flagstones to the shed where the dogs were kept when it was raining. He said, I only got halfway along when my feet slipped on the flagstones and I went up in the air and landed on my backside. Trays of dog food rained down on top of me. I was lying in the mud, covered in wet dog food, with raindrops as big as babies' fists falling on me from the blackened sky. And he said, in that moment, I heard a voice say to me, who the F do you think you are? He said, at that point I began to laugh. I laughed at my own folly. I laughed at my own arrogance. I rolled over, covered in food and mud, and I crawled on all fours back into the house. I pulled myself up onto the kitchen counter, and I said to Manly, we should go to church this Sunday. Do you believe God is tripping people up in their backyards and whispering expletives to them in the middle of the dirt and the dust? Yeah, I do too. Hey, why wouldn't that be God who does that, right? And he knew it was. It was like God was telling me, you're nothing. Who do you think you are? And where would he go to try to decipher that experience? To church. Well, in the 1970s, maybe that's where you would go. He continues the anecdote. He says, when we went to St. Paul's Anglican Church, we sat in the back row, and the rector was berating the congregation before Holy Communion, saying that the previous day at the county fair, he had seen a number of members of his parish entering the jelly bean guessing competition. And because this was tantamount to gambling, you needed to repent of this before you came to receive Holy Communion. I'm just letting that one go straight through the kid. In his autobiography, he says this. I've memorised it. He said, at that point, Manly and I realised that whatever faith we might have had, it needed to remain an entirely private matter. Now, I actually really believe deep down in my bones that God is whispering in people's ears all the time. I'm thoroughly convinced of it. I don't know if you're clergy and you've ever had this experience where people say, oh, what do you do for a job, mate? And you say, I'm a pastor, I'm a priest, I'm a minister of the word, whatever you say. And then they think, have I said any bad words up until this point? And then they'll often say something like, you're a minister of the word, you're a Lying Church minister. Right, okay, well, wow, how about that? Because, my next door neighbour's second cousin's aunt's sister was married to a Methodist minister once. And then you're like, yeah, well, you and I are very similar, obviously, aren't we? And then, while they're kind of connecting with you over what you do, they then will often say, not that I'm religious, I'm not religious at all, actually. Now, I've got a standard response to this. I will always say, oh, you're not religious at all. So you've never had a religious experience before? I reckon it'd be 8 out of 10 people would say, oh, no, I wouldn't say that. Yeah, I have had religious experiences. And I always say, wow, I love collecting people's religious experiences. Like, tell me about one. I've had people say to me when they brought my daughter up and they put her on my chest after I'd given birth to her, I thought, surely life doesn't come from within me. Well, that's pretty religious, isn't it? When I sit on a board and I'm waiting for a swell to come in to catch another wave, I feel the surge of the ocean underneath me. I think, hey. Well, that's religious. I've had people tell me that they've been to ashrams and retreats and they've read sort of Deepak Chopra, or they've been on courses. I mean, people are searching and God is whispering into their hearts, slipping them up, tapping them on the shoulder, evoking a yearning. The mission of God's people is to alert everyone everywhere to the universal reign of God. And one of the best ways we do that is by demonstrating the reign of God and being there at that moment when someone has an experience and asks you to help them decipher it. So imagine if instead of going to St. Paul's Anglican Church, Patrick White went down the local pub and you played darts with him every Thursday night. And imagine if he said to you, hey, you go to church, don't you? Like, you're a Christian, aren't you? And you'd be like, yeah, of course you know that. Right. Can I tell you about something that happened to me? Our task is very often simply to give the language to describe the God who has been at work in their lives, that they are yearning for without fully knowing it, and to show them what a community of faith, which has embraced the values of the kingdom of God, looks like, and to ask them to join you in this journey of becoming a new kind of human. Amen.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really, really appreciate that. And as we go to morning tea, 2 great questions to think about. To whom are you called? And how are we alerting people to the universal reign of God through Christ? Some things that we can talk about over a cuppa and something to eat this morning. So thank you, Mike. Looking forward to session 2, which will be at 11 o'clock after our morning tea. Morning tea is through those double doors and into the hall. There's tea, coffee and food there, so go and enjoy. Thank you. 1, 2. Welcome back, everyone. If you'd like to resume your places, that would be great. Hopefully you enjoyed your morning tea. What a fantastic morning tea the Floreat people put on for us. Really appreciate them doing that. They're working super hard out there in the kitchen, so huge thanks to Floreat. Just before I hand back to Mike, it was so good to hear the chat going on and just that level of conversation and excitement and wondering going on in the hall. That was brilliant. Mike's book, Mission is the Shape of Water, a few people were asking about that and wanting to buy a copy. We don't have hard copies here. Mike doesn't really like to kind of spruik his own stuff, but you can get it online. So, yeah, that's right. He doesn't want to be whipped and booted out of here. So you can go online and get hold of Mike's book that way, and I would encourage you to do that. So I'm going to hand back to Mike now for round 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've written quite a few books, and usually they annoy as many people as like them. So I'm just used to having a fairly polarised response to stuff that I write. You either love it or you hate it. But can I just say, I was mentioning this before to you, David, Mission is the Shape of Water, which came out 2023, I've had nothing but positive responses to it. And I'm thinking, what have I done wrong? Like, it's a book on the history of Christian mission, and the idea of mission is the shape of water is this, not that the gospel, the message or that Christ changes, but that our approach to mission will necessarily change depending what context we're in, just like water does. Water is always H2O, but it is shaped differently depending on what container you put it in. And it's really a book reminding you of the really creative and different forms and approaches that mission has taken throughout 2,000 years of Christian history. And hopefully, even though Andy hasn't got to the last chapter yet, hopefully at the end, a kind of a real call for us to be more bold in hearing what God is doing in our neighbourhoods and being willing to shape mission according to the particular needs or interests of the context. So context actually does have a say in what mission looks like. There's no question about it. We don't really ask our neighbours, what do you think our worship should be like? We don't really ask them, what do you think our theology should be? But we ought to be asking them, how can we serve you? What does it look like for us to be good neighbours and to contribute to the common good in this neighbourhood? And can I just tell you, this has got nothing to do with the talk I'm going to do, but can I tell you one of my favourite stories out of Mission is the Shape of Water? You just said I'm not very good at spruiking my books, but like this is sounding like a big commercial, but you can say no if you're not interested in hearing this story, but this is a story about one of my favourite little heroes of Christian mission. Her name is Alice Seeley Harris. She was a English Baptist missionary in the 1890s. She and her husband John felt God calling them to the Bololo people in Africa, which is kind of on the edge of what was then called the Congo Free State. And so if you see photos of her, and you can Google Alice Seeley Harris photos, and there's a reason, I'll tell you why there are so many of them, but if you see pictures of her, if you've seen Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen, she looks exactly like that. And I didn't get any reaction to that, so clearly you don't know what she looks like. But she's got the big white hat and the linen dress, and she looks like a real feisty Katharine Hepburn type woman. She and her husband go to the Bololo River to do what in the 1890s would have been really conventional conversionist Baptist mission. They go to preach the Bible, to baptise people, plant churches, to convert people. So she goes with this very clear kind of shape of what mission should look like. She'd seen that on the streets of London. She'd heard about that from various missionaries, famous missionaries around the world, and off to Bololo she and John go in order to do that. Before she leaves, someone gives her a really, really expensive gift. Someone says, have you heard about these things? They're called personal cameras. Like, up until that point, a camera was something that a guy had on a tripod with a big black sheet over his head and holding up the flash, you see that in the pictures. Photography was a thing that professionals did. But the personal camera was starting to become more widespread. A missionary could never afford to buy one, but this friend of hers said, why don't you take this? I bought it for you. I don't know, crazy idea. But why don't you take photos of what you're doing in the jungle, and then when you come back you can show us so that we'll get to see them. These days that's standard missionary practice, isn't it? But she's like, crazy idea, all right. So she takes this little camera off to the Bololo River. And as I said, you can see lots of her photos of her standing in front of a whole bunch of African kids sitting at her feet in the jungle with a big pointer pointing something on a whiteboard. It's all very standard conversionist mission. Until one day, in the Bololo mission station, a man from the Congo, a Congolese man, stumbles into their mission station carrying a bundle wrapped up in palm leaves. He's clearly traumatised, and so some of the Africans from the Bololo mission talk to him and introduce him to Alice, and he unfolds this parcel, and it's the remains of his daughter and his wife, just the few parts of their body that he could rescue during a massacre in the Belgian Congo. And of course she's aghast at this, shocked by it. She actually takes one of the most famous human rights photos of all time. She photographs him sitting on the veranda at Bololo with these body parts on the ground. That photo had monumental impact around the world. But when she asks, what is going on? He explains to her that under the cover of darkness, locked down from outside eyes, King Leopold of Belgium has basically created the world's biggest concentration camp. The Belgian Congo, or the Congo Free State, was not free at all. The Congolese were to deliver ivory and rubber to quotas each week, and where they didn't meet their quotas, limbs were removed to make up the tear. If villagers refused to collect any rubber or ivory, there were wholesale massacres. People were slaughtered, they were whipped with these really horrible whips with all these kind of metal in it, or they were tied in nets and boulders and thrown into the Congo River. We don't even know how many millions of Congolese died as a result of the most despicable human rights violations of the 20th century. It's happening she's right on the doorstep to this. He explains what's going on. These are the only parts of my wife and daughter I could rescue in order that they might be properly buried. And she decides to do a remarkable thing. This is where I get kind of all excited about Alice Seeley Harris. She decides she's going to see for herself. And so she reshapes her mission, not to do classic conversionist mission, but basically to be ferried into the Congo under the cover of darkness to avoid the force publique that was kind of running this place. And in there, she would collect testimonies from victims and photograph them. So that's why if you Google Alice Seeley Harris photographs, you'll see lots of Congolese people sitting very straight on a chair in a very conventional kind of photographic pose with one arm, or with massive scars across their chests, or with facial scars. And she dignifies them with these beautiful portraits, takes down their testimony, and gathered such a data of information. She then in 1903 goes back to England and goes on a speaking tour showing these photos on a magic lantern display, a bit like a slideshow, and reading what's going on. You could imagine 1903 looking at pictures like this would have been utterly stunning. There are a couple of other well-known activists who had started to agitate for the end of the Congo Free State, but it was Alice Seeley Harris's photographs that actually brought it to life. Within 3 years of her doing this, she also does an American tour, 20 cities around America, giving lectures and showing the photographs. Within 3 years of her doing this, European parliaments and the Americans put so much pressure on Belgium that the Congo Free State was dismantled. It's one of the most rapid and most effective human rights campaigns in history, actually. She had the courage and the tenacity to realise that her mission needed to be reshaped around the particular urgent needs of the people to whom God had sent her. Now, it's a very dramatic example, isn't it? But sometimes you often hear people say, no, I know horrors are happening right across the river in the jungle there, but I was called to this. But some of the most remarkable mission has happened throughout history where people have actually been willing to leave what was tried and true and traditional and to which they had initially felt called, to let go of that, to hold that loosely enough to be open to what it might be that God actually has really sent them there to do. Do you know when Ignatius of Loyola started the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits as we often know them? Within his own lifetime, there was a reaction against the Jesuits, and there was talk about the Pope actually disbanding the society. So this was Ignatius's life's work to create this order, this missionary order. And within his own lifetime, it looked like it could be snuffed out by a papal bull, just like that. And somebody said to him once, how would you feel if the Pope just ended what you've given your whole adult life to? And he said, I love this answer, he said, oh, it would be terrible. He said, I should think it would take me a good half day of prayer to really get over it. A good half day of prayer. Like, I'm holding this thing that God called me to, that I love, that I've thrown everything into, but I hold it loosely enough that if this is not God's will and that is, I'm willing to move in that direction. All the best missionary enterprises have been led by people like that. I could talk about a whole book about it, but that's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about now. I better get started on what I am going to talk about and talk really quickly so we can get through it. When we're thinking about mission, I mentioned to you before that David Bosch uses the word to alert people. And I talked about how that's a good use of an English word because it's rubbery and loose enough to involve a variety of things. I talked about the need for us to demonstrate the reign of God, for us to look like a different kind of society, to be committed to living out the values of the kingdom like justice and peace and healing and hope and joy and all those sorts of things. But in this second session, I do want to talk about what it looks like for us to speak about this and to alert people in words. Because it feels to me as though we've come through a period where a previous generation was all about words and evangelism and preaching and rallies and crusades. And it feels like there's been a real swing in the other direction. It's like, whoa, it's not just about words. We've got to demonstrate this. We've got to show people what the reign of God looks like, to the exclusion, to some degree, of words. Have you ever heard people quote St. Francis of Assisi where he says, preach the gospel at all times and use words if necessary? Francis never said that, but aside from that, David Bosch said in response to that, of course words are necessary. Unexplained actions in and of themselves do not constitute the full mission of God's people. Unexplained actions in and of themselves do not constitute the full mission of God's people. How could someone observe the values of the reign of God in your life, but not ever be given any ideas on how to decipher that or make sense of the role of Jesus in your life that allows you to be that person? So there does need to be words spoken. And here I realise people get a bit antsy with me when I start talking about evangelism because they often kind of get little ticks in their eyes and kind of have had really bad experiences about it. But talking about our faith oughtn't to be browbeating or controlling or manipulative. It actually can be winsome and beautiful and gentle. And by way of referring to that, I wanted to have a look at Colossians chapter 4, because Colossians chapter 4 is actually about prayer. But in that prayer, Paul kind of betrays his understanding of what evangelism would look like. This is Colossians 4. I'm going to read verses 2 to 6. As I said, it's about prayer, but you'll pick up the undercurrent is actually about the mission of God's people. So he's wrapping up his letter and he says this: "Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should." Verse 5, he says, "Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Now, even though this is a prayer, kind of a closing request for prayer, I can see in this passage the kind of implicit assumption that there are kind of two kinds of Christians operating in the mission of God's people with respect to evangelism. In that passage, he says, "Pray for us." Now, clearly Paul there is referring to himself and his apostolic band, the kind of mobile community of church planters and preachers and evangelists that are moving from one place to another and coming back to that place and going back to the base and continuing to fan into flame the faith of God's people throughout Asia Minor and beyond. Pray for us, our apostolic band, for a couple of things. He says, pray that we would have boldness, would take the opportunities that arise, and we would be bold in our proclamation, and pray that we would do it with clarity. We wouldn't screw it up. We would actually speak the truth. Now, that kind of language makes it sound like, for people like Paul and for others, evangelism or faith sharing is something that happens by seizing opportunities, putting your foot in the door, putting your shoulder to the door, opening opportunities, getting invited to the Areopagus, or getting invited to the synagogue, or being presented before secular governors or rulers, or being tried. It's kind of like, yes, grab the opportunity. It's arisen. Pray that I'd be really bold in the way I proclaim. Pray that I would do it with clarity. Pray that I would get the message out in quick time, in the moment that is available to me. And maybe you've heard lots of evangelists who talk like that, right? Seize every opportunity. Turn the conversation when you can. If someone raises a question, put your foot in the door. Make it happen. It sounds a little bit like a travelling salesman or something, doesn't it? It's kind of like, go get them. You can do it. In many respects, I think there is a kind of an evangelist like that. There is a kind of faith sharer who does make the most of every opportunity, who does put their foot in the door, who can make things happen, and who does have extraordinary opportunities to proclaim widely and with clarity. But the interesting thing in verse 5 is, if we're all meant to do that, why doesn't Paul say, and you should pray that for yourselves too? You Colossians, pray you'd have opportunities. Pray you'd be bold in your proclamation. You should be praying that you would have real clarity in what you share. But he doesn't. Even though he asks for them to pray for him and the apostolic band, the evangelists, the church planters, if you like, that they would be bold and outspoken and make the most of every opportunity, when it comes to talking about how they should pray for themselves, let me just read it again. Verse 5, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Now, it seems to me that when it comes to the mission of evangelism, that Paul, I think, imagines it will happen in a kind of two-speed kind of way. There will be a small group of people who are gifted and peculiarly called proclaimers. And maybe there are some here in this room right now. You just can do it. You get opportunities, you seize upon them, you're always looking for ways to get in. You can speak and share the gospel in ways that are engaging and interesting and provocative. Clearly that was Paul and his mates. But I think in Paul's economy of mission, that's a small minority, of which he includes himself. For most of us, we're like the Colossians. And he doesn't ask us to be bold and put our foot in the door and seize every opportunity. What he asks us to do is to be really good conversationalists, be salty in the way we speak, be wise in the way we engage socially with people, and then be willing to answer people's questions. You all with me so far? You all still end up talking about Jesus to some degree. But whereas the former group, the smaller group, would do so by taking the initiative, the second group, the larger group, will often find themselves talking about Jesus in response to people's questions. So you would be wise in the way you socialise. You have lots and lots of friends in the city. You'd be a really fascinating conversationalist. People are really intrigued by what you say and how you live your life and what you've seen. That you've seen people healed, that you've seen people find hope, that you're living a new kind of life. Like that would be intriguing and delicious. And that when people then ask you, well, how does that work? How did you get there? Your way of speaking about Jesus would be in response to questions. And just let me check again. Are you all with me so far? Most of us are in the second category. And what we don't really need are evangelists from the first category telling us that we're meant to be like them, because we're not like them. And when you try to be like them, you really screw it up. Maybe you remember this from the old days. You also feel super guilty that you're no good at it. But no, here's what I want you to do instead. Be really good at socialising. Be a really interesting conversationalist. And just wait for the questions to flow in. Problem is, many people in our churches have been trained in how not to stand out or be different from their neighbours. The assumption, I think, behind the Colossians chapter 4 prayer is this, that you would live such questionable lives, that your values, that your conduct, that the way you spend your money, what you do with your house, how you raise your children, how you treat your neighbours, how you treat the refugee or the outcast or the Indigenous person, that it would be so peculiar, so unlikely, so intriguing that people could not help but say, what's with that? Why do you do that? And it's there you have the opportunity to alert people to the reign of God working in your life. And yet, as I just said, our churches are full of people who don't look any different to their fine, upstanding, non-Christian neighbours. We've actually trained people, don't be weird, don't stand out, don't make Christianity look like it's kooky or bizarre or nutty. We've told them, fit in, be a good guy, hang out, be a normal person. We're just like them. Go on the same holidays that they go on. Renovate your kitchen the same amount of money as they spend. Put your kids in the same schools they do. Like, be fine and upstanding. And the kind of fantasy is that you're going to go to work on Monday morning and you'll be at the water cooler or the coffee maker and someone's going to say, hey, what did you do on the weekend? Oh, I went to this concert. What did you do on the weekend? Had a barbecue with my friends. What did you do on the weekend? I went to church. And they're all going to go, you what? You went where? What? Tell me more about it. This is intriguing. I've never heard anything like this. Well, tell me, what happens at this thing called church? The fact is, folks, lots of people don't know what goes on in church, but they're not the least bit interested in it. And neither is it a particularly radical or weird or outrageous thing to do. So here is Paul saying, probably the primary way that you'll actually speak about Jesus is his response to questions. And we've trained our congregations not to live in any questionable way whatsoever. And yet this was, as I mentioned to you in the last session, the way the early church overcame the Roman Empire. Like, it was standard practice in Paul's time for a man to have 3 women at his disposal. His wife to keep his home and raise his children, a mistress for him to socialise with, and a concubine for sex. It wasn't considered disgusting or terrible or misogynistic. It was just the way us ancient men live. What's the big deal about it? And yet, when Christianity gets started, it starts equipping people to treat their spouses as their brother or their sister, to be loyal, to be loving, to be compassionate and gentle. Like, people were just like, what's wrong with you? The early church, we discovered, actually was so compassionate that if they heard plague had hit a nearby township, they would pray, asking the Spirit to reveal to them which among us should relocate to that town in order to minister to the sick and probably die in order to share the gospel with that community. Like, who are you people? Like, this is unbelievable. Like, Christians lived such radically alternative lives. Of course people were going to ask them, why would you do something like that? So much so that in the 4th century, Julian the Apostate, a Roman emperor who tried to take Rome back into paganism because he believed that all the woes of the empire were the result of the empire flirting with Christianity. He sends out an edict to all the governors throughout Asia Minor. He says, I've done a study of why Christianity has become so popular. They feed the hungry, they attend to the needs of the poor, they visit those who are sick. He even mentions they tend to the graves of people who aren't even part of their family. They practice radical hospitality. And so in this edict, he says, I am sending you, and he lists how many carts full of wine and olive oil and what have you. I'm sending you all this money, all these resources, so that you might use them to build feeding programs and hospices and tend to the graves of people in your community to kind of outlove the Christians and stop people from feeling that they have to go to the Christianity to get that. Now, this is one of the first ever expressions of a social security system being proposed within the ancient world. We, the state, will take care of the needs of the poor so they won't go and join the Christians because that's what they're doing. And can you imagine what happens when a pagan emperor sends cartloads full of goodies to local pagan governors around the area, saying, use this for the poor? Guess where it all ends up? Yeah, not with the poor. Because what Julian could not possibly understand is that caring for the poor, ministering to the sick, practicing a different kind of family ethic, these were not strategies. These were not techniques that maybe we could win some people by doing this. This was the overflow of the reign of God surging through the hearts and souls of those who are part of the church. So that when you do live like that, of course, people will ask you. So to be told, folks, you should be telling others about the reign of God and explaining who Jesus is. But no one ever asks them a question. Can you see how cruel that is? Maybe what we need to do is to wind it back a bit before we start cracking the whip about getting people to go share the message of Jesus. Maybe what we need to do is just do some workshops on how to be weird and how to be better at socialising. You know, Christians can be pretty bad at that, have you noticed? You ever been to a social gathering and thought, bet she's a Christian, bet he's a Christian? Like, you can pick it. Am I speaking out of turn? Like, sometimes we can be awfully awkward. Sometimes we don't live lives that are any different to anybody else. So what would it look like if we actually started to live like that? Some years ago now, I was part of Love Makes a Way. You familiar with what that is? A network of Christians who are committed to practicing radical hospitality toward asylum seekers and refugees. Do you remember when the Guardian, the online Guardian newspaper, released the Nauru papers, and we finally, for the first time, actually read the medical reports of what was going on in Nauru. Do any of you remember this? Remember Nauru and Manus were in a kind of a media lockdown. No one really knew what was going on there, what life was like there. Department of Foreign Affairs would tell us what it was like, but we never actually really knew what it was like. And then doctors from the medical centre on Nauru broke their contracts, released medical reports to the Guardian that then redacted names and what have you, and published them. And I can actually remember where I was when I read them. And I was both infuriated and heartbroken. I read a story about a little child that was compulsively swallowing stones from the playground in the hope that that might kill her. Like, what little child has to have a plan for how to commit suicide, let alone one as tragic and naive as that? I heard stories of teenagers that couldn't even get out of their beds. They'd almost completely psychologically shut down, lacking all impetus or energy for life. I mean, you put people on an island and you say, you'll never get off here, you'll never have an education, you'll never have a job, you'll never have a life. What do we think would happen to them? Let alone the instances of post-traumatic stress, sexual assault. I mean, it was just one terrible story after another. Some of you will know Jared McKenna and people like that. I called him and said, we've got to do something, haven't we? He's like, we've got something in mind. Do you want to join us? And so on this occasion, a group of us, all clergy, went and did a, Love Makes a Way, prayer sit-ins in politicians' offices. We went to Malcolm Turnbull's office in Sydney, walked into the waiting area or into the front office. The woman behind the counter knew immediately what we were. Everyone was dressed in their clergy outfits. I mean, the Uniting Church, you got good gear, you got all that kind of colourful stuff, and the Catholic guy, the nun, they all looked the part. The Baptist had a black shirt on, so all we can do. We're useless when it comes to liturgy and outfits. But all these clergy walk in and she's like, oh, no, not you guys. She knew immediately what was going to happen. And we said, well, no, we're not going to disrupt you at all. We're just going to kneel here and pray. And so she calls the police. The police arrived. These two young cops walk in. We're on the floor on our knees praying. And I could hear the cops talking to the woman behind the counter. And he said, well, they're not really blocking traffic, and we don't want to haul that old nun out onto the street. There's media out there, there's people with cameras. And I heard this cop say, look, how long can you pray for anyway? He said, if by some chance they're still here at 5 o'clock tonight when you want to go home, call us and we'll come back. And that's when I realised, I'm going to be praying here till 5 o'clock tonight. Now, I knew a couple of these ministers, but not all of them. I don't know if you've ever had this experience of praying all day with people you just met, but there is a strangely beautiful intimacy that emerges. It wasn't even like, tell me about yourself or we hardly talked to each other about ourselves. We prayed. We read the Nauru papers. I prayed for that little girl swallowing the stones. We prayed for people who couldn't get out of bed. We prayed, there were no names, but we prayed for each of these. I prayed with tears running down my nose. And the Uniting Church woman who was there, she was great. She was a worship leader or something. So occasionally she'd burst into song, into all these old hymns. And again, us Baptists, we don't have the gear, we don't have stoles, we don't have nothing, and we're really shit at liturgy as well. So I was just mouthing the words. I didn't really kind of even know them. But she led us in this beautiful kind of movement of prayer and song right throughout the day. The Anglican minister called his wife and she bought like Holy Communion paraphernalia. So we ate bread and we drank juice and we prayed and prayed and prayed, God, do something. At 10 to 5, the big doors to the entry area burst open and like about 20 cops pour into the waiting room. They had like riot gear on. They had tasers, they had guns, they had like the whole thing. And I thought, that nun is really not going to give you that much trouble, seriously. But as they burst in, the Uniting Church minister had said to us just a few minutes before, well, I don't know how much time we've got. Why don't we sing Amazing Grace? And so we started. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. And at that point, the cops burst forth. And it was beautifully hilarious because they're all ready to arrest. So they burst in and we're all singing Amazing Grace and they all go, so they all take 2 or 3 steps back. They're surrounding us at this point. And every time like we finished a verse, there's half a beat before the next one, you know this. So every time we'd finish a verse, they would all bristle and step forward and into the second verse. They'd be like... Now I thought there was only 4 verses to Amazing Grace. I don't know, the Anglicans or you guys, I don't know, invented a whole bunch of them because that song went on for a really long time. And these cops would not arrest us while we were singing it. And I thought, it's not like there's a force field here. There's still some vestige of respect for devotion, that they would respectfully wait until this act of worship. And then when finally, the Anglican ran out of verses, they step forward and they arrest us. We each got 1 cop, one on each arm. We get lifted up. I'm standing next to the young guy who came that morning. And it's like, don't lead them out yet. We've got to go out quickly. There's the media out there. There's trucks from the TV stations and all that jazz. So get them in a line and then quick, out into the police wagon. So I'm right near the door. I have to wait there while everyone gets kind of sorted. And the cop who's holding my arm, who wasn't scary, he looked like the work experience cop, I thought. He was a very young fellow. He said, I came here this morning. He said, have you guys been praying all day? I said, yeah, we have been. No, I'm saying have prayers been coming out of your mouth all day? Yes, I said, prayers and songs all day. Wow, he said, why? What are you doing? I said, what am I doing? I said, I've run out of things to do. I don't know what else to do. I've visited my local member, I don't know how many times. In those days, my local member was Tony Abbott, so you can imagine. I've visited my local member, I've marched, I've signed petitions, I've prayed, I've been part of rallies, I've done everything I think I could possibly do. And I'm out of things to do. I don't know what else there is to do. And I think to myself, all I can do, mate, is just pray. All I can do is say, Jesus, please do something. And we're locking little children up in prisons. We're taking away all sense of hope. We're destroying their very psycho-spiritual makeup. We're crushing people who have just tried to escape from horror. And I don't know what else to do. I can't change anything. I just have to say, God, please do something. And by this point, he's leading me out through the foyer. He said, but why are you all ministers? Why are ministers into this? I said, because I'll tell you why. Because Jesus actually taught us a different way to be human. A way which includes generosity and hospitality and inclusion and mercy and love and kindness. That we're meant to be different kinds of people. Not ordinary people, not everyday people, not self-centered people, not violent people, not greedy people, but a new way of being human. He showed us what that would look like with his own life and his teaching and his death and his sacrifice. He defeated sin and death and fear and violence and all the worst things in the world. And he promises us there's a new life, there's a better way to be. And I want to be like that. And I don't know how to be like that other than just to cry out, Jesus, help us, help us. And at this point, he's loading me into the back of the police wagon. And he says, I'd like to live like that. I said, well, get in here with me. And he smiled and he said, I don't want it that much. And I thought to myself, lots of Christians don't want it that much either. I was on the news that night. When I got home, my neighbour across the road Steve, he's a Tyler, bit younger than me. He saw my car pull up and he rushed out of his house. He said, I saw you on the TV. He thought it was hilarious that his neighbour, the minister, was arrested on TV. He said, that was cool. He said, like, why did you do that? Tell me about it. I had the same conversation with him in the gutter outside his house. Same story, same vision of the world, same Jesus, same impotence, same crying out for Jesus to work. Now, friends, I didn't do that so that Steve would ask me why I did it. I did it as an end in itself. But one of the remarkable things when we exercise our commitment to hospitality and generosity and mercy and kindness is that people will ask us. And if no one has ever asked you, what are you doing wrong? I'm sorry not to sound judgmental, but what are you doing wrong? If no one has ever said, what's up with you? Why do you live like that? In that setting, to be able to talk about your friend, your hero, your role model, your Saviour, Jesus. Sometimes it can just be a simple little conversation, sometimes big, long one. I went to a dinner party recently with some friends of ours who are Christians, but most of the people who were there were not Christians. And I don't know about you, but there are times when I feel like I've talked to a lot of people about Jesus a lot lately, so I'm sure the Lord would understand if I had the night off tonight. Do you ever feel like that? It's kind of, let's just not get into it. Let's just talk about the footy or the weather or some movie we just saw or some TV show we just streamed, hey? Like, I'm going to keep it really light. And my wife is like, yeah, okay. So we sit at this table. My wife is down the far end of the table. I'm here. There's a guy on the end. He came without his wife because she was ill. And the host is sitting opposite me. This guy had a few drinks. It was a big, loud, garrulous, fun kind of guy. And the woman sitting across from me, who, as I said, was the host, said to me, Mike, how's your new book going? Is it selling well? And he says, you've written a book? Wow. What's your book about? Now remember, I'm not getting into it tonight. Like, the Lord's given me a free pass. At least that's what I told him. And so I thought, how do I kill this conversation? So I said, it's about innovative ways of fashioning faith collectives. He's not going to know what that means, and he'll just like, oh, and we'll move on. But no. He reaches into his top pocket and he says, are you kidding me? He said, I'm the director of the Australian Institute for Innovation. And I said, oh, shit. Tell me about your paradigm for innovation, he says. And we kind of get talking. He's starting to put two and two together. Faith collect, our churches, innovative. Oh, I got it. And then at one point he says, you know those guys who talk in a big loud voice so the whole table can be part of what they're saying? He says, you know what the problem with people like you is? So the whole table goes quiet so they can find out what the problem with people like me is. You know what the problem with people like you is? He said, you've got a bloody good product, but your delivery system is screwed. He says, as a glug of his wine. Everyone goes back to their conversations. And I said to him, actually, I said, that's pretty much what that book is about. Like, we do have a good product, but the delivery system is not working. But I said, I'm just interested, like, probably just for market research purposes, like, what do you think is so good about our product? Like, be interested to know. He said, well, what I meant was, like, Jesus is your product. You got no problems there. But you're going to get a church to get him, and church sucks. No, I said, no, I got it. I know that's what you meant. But I'm just wondering, like, you think Jesus is a pretty good product. So, like, what do you think are the really salient features of Jesus? Like, what are What are the things you really like about him that we should probably really emphasise? Like, what do you think? Why do you think Jesus is such a good product? Oh, gotcha. He said, yeah, no. You got no problem with Jesus. Stick with Jesus. Jesus is great. He's so good. He did a lot of, he was really, Jesus does, when I think about Jesus, he was always, Jesus used to, I'm thinking Jesus used to, he did a lot of stuff where and I said, mate, you don't actually know anything about Jesus, do you? He said, I wouldn't say that. I know he was like, he was born at Easter and he died at Christmas and, stuff like that. But actually, he said, now you mention it, I probably don't know very much about him at all. I said, well, you're still right. I do think he's a bloody good product. So would you mind if I took 3 minutes and told you why you're right? Why Jesus is a really good product? And you don't have to get a church to get him. This guy plonks down his big balloon of wine. He's like, fire. Folks, I want everyone in your church to know what they were going to say next. Not to preach, not to browbeat, not to condemn, to just be able